And I will see how this chat box works. I see some folks in the chat box are waiting. It says everyone can see and hear me. Hopefully folks can see and hear me.
Again, go ahead and ask that question again.
Okay. What I wanted to do is have folks just quickly put in the chat box one word that maybe comes to mind when you're thinking about special education or serving students with disabilities in the classroom, in the school setting, serving students that are struggling. What's one word that might come to mind? And if you don't mind putting that comment in the chat box. Frustrating. Yep. We do hear that quite a bit. Sometimes folks will, a lot of times, even when we're asking this question, sometimes to professionals that serve students or professionals that work in early intervention, and especially when we ask parents this, we hear a lot of, it's frustrating, it's confusing, it's exhausting, it's difficult, it's, stressful, all those things, because it is complicated territory to navigate. And now I will go back to, okay, well, what I wanted to do real quick is go over today's learning objectives. So today what we're going to do is summarize formal ways that schools can serve students with disabilities, because there's a lot of informal ways that all students can be served, but there are some specific ways, formal ways that schools can serve students with disabilities. And we're going to distinguish the key differences between a 504 plan and an IEP, which stands for an individualized education program. And then we're also going to identify who is recognized as a parent under the IDEA, or the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. And I seem to have, there we go. I was like, did I skip a slide? There it is. I was like, when do I get to talk a little bit about ECAC? I'm going to do that now. So as I mentioned, I am the PTI Assistant Manager at ECAC, the Exceptional Children's Assistance Center. ECAC is a private nonprofit parent organization. And by that, we mean it's by parents and for parents. And we are committed to improving the lives and education of all children, but with a special emphasis on those children with disabilities and special healthcare needs. And so we do serve all 100 North Carolina counties. We have several projects and programs that are kind of housed under our roof. Our largest program is what is known as a PTI, or a Parent Training and Information Center. PTIs are funded by the U.S. Department of Education's Office of Special Education Programs, and they came about as a direct result of that Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, the IDEA. And so basically the Fed said, hey, we are going to require that every state have a free resource where they can go and get information about navigating systems such as early intervention, special education, the transition to adulthood, where they can go ahead and get information to understand their rights, and where they can connect with other resources. And so North Carolina has been serving as the PTI, or ECAC has been serving as North Carolina's PTI for several decades, actually. We also have some other funded partnerships at ECAC, which include the North Carolina Deaf-Blind Project. This is a collaboration with the North Carolina Department of Public Instruction and Eastern Carolina University. And the focus of that project is for families that have a child that have both deafness and blindness. We also have a part in the North Carolina State Improvement Project. This is a program that is also funded by the Office of Special Education Programs, so the U.S. Department of Education. And they are primarily made up of staff from the North Carolina Department of Public Instruction. And what we do is, so we have kind of focus areas. And so they do a lot around family engagement. In the past, there's been a heavy focus on literacy and math. They do a lot with stakeholder involvement, trying to get parents at the table to give them input and inform them on how folks are doing. And they do a lot to prepare future educators for providing quality instruction to students with disabilities. And one of the other programs and projects that we have several contracts with is the North Carolina Infant Toddler Program, and that is what we would refer to as the early intervention program that serves children with disabilities and special health care needs that are under the age of 3. And so we do a lot with them as far as educating families on that transition from early intervention to preschool and from preschool to kindergarten, and also parent leadership, because we're all about having parents use their voice, use their experiences to impact systems, to serve on decision-making groups, and to really ultimately improve outcomes for children with disabilities. And then lastly, LENS NC, which is Learning for Equity and Network for Solutions. And the focus of that work is really on the intersection of race and educational equity and learning differences. And so their purpose is they really seek to improve the lives of the 1 in 5 children who struggle with learning and attention issues, and the less than favorable outcomes for the ones who are low income students and students of color. Now I will advance my screen. So I mentioned that there are several ways that we can help students that are struggling learners. And so there's some informal ways, which might include what is known as MTSS, or you might have heard it as tier interventions, or you maybe have heard it referred to as RTI, response to intervention. That is a school-wide approach, and it's available to all students. And it's really put in place to address the needs of students, including struggling learners and students with disabilities. And so you might hear that the school is implementing these interventions for your child. Sometimes it's in a specific area. It could be reading, it could be math, it could be social emotional skills or behavior. It's something that is available and in place for all students. They go in tiers, and the tier 1 is usually something that's provided for all students. Sometimes there'll be a student that's struggling a little bit more in a certain area, and then they might increase the intensity or frequency of what they're doing, and that student is then placed on a tier 2 intervention. And if that doesn't work, that usually means, maybe they're pulling them aside. They're going to do some group work. They'll do some small group setting where they're going to focus on some of those areas of concern. And if that doesn't work, sometimes those students are then placed on what we call tier 3 interventions. That is not special education. It's not something that is exclusive for students with disabilities. It is something that is available to all students. And certainly those higher tiers are in place for those students that are struggling to learn. But there are 2 formal ways to serve students with disabilities. And these 2 formal ways are specifically for students that have been identified as having a disability. And one of them is through Section 504, which is a federal civil rights law. And the other is through the IDEA, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, which is our federal special education law. And both of these apply to the entire United States. So what we're going to do is go through what I call the 504 basics. This is the first one that we will talk about as far as a formal plan to serve students. So Section 504 is a federal law, and it's designated or designed to protect the rights of the individuals with disabilities in programs and activities that receive federal funds or federal financial assistance from the U.S. Department of Education. And so that would definitely be all of our public schools. And Section 504 is an anti-discrimination civil rights statute, and it requires that the needs of students with disabilities be met as adequately as the needs of the non-disabled are met. And so Section 504, it allows for what we call equal access to the or equal opportunity of to the learning environment. And so sometimes you'll hear a 504 plan might be put in place to what we call level the playing field. And so we'll talk about what is involved with Section 504 and what maybe a plan might look like. So what is the 504 plan? So I mentioned this is a formal plan. This is important because a lot of times when we're talking to families that have a child that's having some trouble at school, they'll say, well, the teacher said they're already doing this or they're already doing that. but it's not documented in a formal plan. And while that's well-meaning and may be helpful, it's not helpful if it's not in a formal plan, because then it becomes subjective and almost optional. And so then you might have, maybe there's a substitute that comes in and doesn't know what that teacher was doing to support this student, or maybe the child up and moves to another school and doesn't know what the previous school had in place, or that child advances to the next grade and there was some supports in place that the child needed, but the next teacher doesn't know. And that's why we always encourage folks, if you're hearing that the school is providing some accommodations for your child, it may be time to request a 504 plan where you've got something official in place, and then that makes folks accountable to providing what that child needs. And so the 504 plan details how the school is going to provide any supports and remove barriers for a student with disability. And again, the purpose is all about giving equal access. And so when we think about removing barriers through a 504 plan, this is usually intended for students that spend their entire day in what is known as a general education classroom. And the supports that they put in place are known as accommodations. Accommodations are supports, modifications, and adaptations that provide the student with perhaps a change of environment, a change to the curriculum format, or maybe it could be equipment to allow access to the content, or maybe access in order to complete a task. And so thinking of some examples of accommodations could be extra time. A student might need extra time to complete assignments. A student might need extra time on tests. They may need to take those tests in a separate setting where there's, away from distractions. It could be that they need things read aloud to them. It could be that the student needs preferential seating, which that's an individual determination of what preferential is. For many students, the preferential seating means closer to the teacher, maybe at the front of the class, closer to where the instruction is being delivered to minimize distractions. For some students, preferential seating, maybe they have a disability or a condition that requires them to use the bathroom a lot. And so the preferential seating might be closest to the door, things like that. Accommodations could be the use of a fidget. We know a lot of kids have a lot of sensory needs. And so having a fidget or something that they can, maybe have a hold of, maybe it's a fidget toy, maybe it's, those fidget spinners were real popular for a while, but maybe it's just something they need in their hands to help them to stay organized. There's wiggly seats. Some students will utilize noise reduction headphones from when, obviously not so much from when they're receiving the instruction, but when they're having to do the work. And so when you think about these supports, oftentimes they're related to the volume of work. Sometimes we have students that can do the work, but they're easily fatigued and it takes them a long amount of time. And so they might get a shortened assignment where instead of having to do 10 questions, they only have to do 5. Sometimes we'll see that students that are really struggling with homework where, the expectation was that it should take 30 minutes and then these kids are spending 2 hours. That's a conversation with the teacher to say, can we have an accommodation that he only gets graded on what he can complete in 30 minutes? And then sometimes the accommodation is just in support, increasing the amount of personal assistance that student may need. We've got some students that are going to need maybe a tap on the shoulder or a visual cue or reminders to get back on task. So there's all kinds of creative things that folks can do when thinking about how to support a student that may be struggling. So how does Section 504 define an individual with a disability? So they've got these 3 prongs. It could be a person who has a physical or a mental impairment that substantially limits a major life activity. And we've got another slide to talk about what is a major life activity. It could be a student that has a record of such an impairment or is regarded as having an impairment. And so an impairment in itself is not a disability. The impairment must substantially limit one or more major life activity in order for it to be considered a disability under Section 504. Well, how does Section 504 define a physical or mental impairment? So you can see they've got a big word here. It could be any physiological disorder or condition, which could include a mental or psychological disorder. It could be a cosmetic disfigurement, or it could be this is there, like I said, these big words, anatomical loss affecting one or more of the following body systems. And so you can see I had to get my font really small because there is a lot of major body systems. And so it could be neurological, it could be respiratory, it could be involving the speech organs, it could be cardiovascular, the reproductive, digestive, urinary, lymphatic, endocrine. So you could see that it really is not an exhaustive list. It really could just be anything that almost affects any body system or bodily system. So let's talk about major life activity. So major life activities are, well, it could be a variety of things. It could be, whoops, sorry, I did not mean to hit my button there. It includes caring for oneself. And so it could be, you got to be able to bend, you got to be able to speak, see, breathe. It could be hearing, learning, eating, reading, sleeping, concentrating. The learning and the concentrating is often where we'll see students will be found eligible for the 504 plan. This is particularly true for those students that really struggle with attention. And maybe they have a diagnosis of ADD or ADHD or maybe even anxiety. But we know that in order to be able to receive the instruction and participate in class, you have to be able to learn and be able to concentrate. And we have some students that really do struggle in this area. And so also thinking about, you have to be able to walk, think, stand, got to be able to communicate, lift, you got to be able to do the work. And so, and this is just a small example of what some of these major life activities might be. And so think of them, the best way to simplify it is it's basic activities that the average person in the general population can do without difficulty. So what is a substantial limitation? And this is oftentimes where sometimes schools and parents will, there'll be some conflict because the school will say, well, we don't see the substantial limitation. I have a family I'm helping right now, and this is the case. And then we have parents that say, oh no, this really is substantial in our book. This is what we're seeing. But the definition of substantial limitation includes, that they're unable to perform a major life activity that the average person or the general population could do, or they're significantly restricted as to the condition or manner or duration under which an individual can perform a major life activity that the average person or general population could do. And so we'll see this oftentimes for students with dyslexia, where the reading is, that's quite a feat for them, where they can do it, but it's going to take them additional time and they're going to need some additional support in that area. Another determining factor is that when folks are trying to decide, is this substantial? There's no rule book. So it's like on a case-by-case basis. And so we got to get some folks that are knowledgeable about the student to come together and really look at what do we know, what are we seeing, and then can we determine that this is a substantial limitation in respect to the individual student. And it really should be, folks that are familiar with the student.
So Amy,
yeah.
we have a question.
Mm-hmm.
One of the questions is, why have a 504 or IEP? It is easier to have just one.
So
I think those,
Gotcha. Yeah. So that is an excellent question because there's some confusion about this. What happens is students, and we haven't got to the IEP, the deep dive on the IEP yet, but students that have an IEP are automatically covered under what is known as Section 504. Whereas students that have just a 504 plan do not have all the same protections and rights as a student that has an IEP. And so Eventually, we're going to get to a slide, and that's if I get to the right slide. Basically, we're going to explain the difference between a 504 and an IEP. A 504 provides a student with a disability accommodations only, whereas an IEP provides a student with accommodations, specially designed instruction, and they get the IEP is much more detailed document. It's got goals in there. They have certain requirements as far as who has to be part of the team. And so the 504, while it can be more than enough for some students, some are going to actually need more than an accommodation. They're going to need more than that changed environment. They're actually going to need what we call special education, where their instruction is delivered by a special education teacher, or it's been specially designed to meet their individual needs. And so every now and then we'll come across a student that has both a 504 and an IEP, and we're like, well, how did that happen? When you look at some of the language from the North Carolina Department of Public Instruction, they said there's no need for that. The only time that I've ever understood that to make sense is sometimes you might have a student that has a 504 plan in place because maybe they have asthma. And so that's a student that's going to need some reasonable accommodations as far as being able to rest, or maybe on those days where the asthma is really getting flared up, they get excused from recess or certain activities, being able to have access to the nurse or the inhaler, being able to have frequent breaks, things like that. Well, then that student maybe down the road is identified as having maybe a speech impairment. And so they're going to need some specially designed instruction in the area of speech. Maybe they're going to get speech therapy. That would be their specially designed instruction. So in that case, sometimes we'll see that where the student had the 504 for one thing and then had the IEP for another, but really it should all be housed still within that IEP. And so if a student has an IEP, and they meet all their goals and then they're exited, they can still exit and still keep their 504 plan. They can maybe keep some of their accommodations if the folks come together and say, yeah, we still see that we've got some stuff here. I just want to check something real quick. Joanne, I stopped sharing my screen because I don't think that I have my correct PowerPoint up. And so I just want to double check and make sure I got this right. Okay. I think I see it now. Sorry about that. And I will go back to sharing my screen because I said this is not.
That's okay. Amy, one of the things that I think is really, really great to hear that you're doing is, ECAC does these workshops for social workers, other professionals, families. So I really have always thought something like this is such a great idea to do for the teachers and the other people involved in IEPs and families all together, so that you're all hearing the same information.
Yep.
So, and this is great information for the whole process of why it all happens. And honestly, this whole process came about because families advocated for it. So that's a really important thing for everyone to understand. So I'm just so glad. I'm just so happy when I see a Parent Training and Information Center information, because I know that it's getting around to everyone. And again, you all can request these workshops for your local groups, for your community. So I'm just I'm really excited
and we
about
can
that.
tailor it, if you have a specific topic that you really want us to hone in on, we can do that. We could just do 504s, we could just do IEPs, we can tailor it specifically to your group and your group's needs. Okay, I think I got my act together now and have the right one. So let me go ahead and reshare, because that was confusing me when I was. Where did these circles come from? They're not on my PowerPoint. I apparently have too many PowerPoints on my.
I think we all have that issue lately.
Yeah. So forgive me, folks. New platform, and I am going to. What are you seeing now? Do you see?
We're not seeing PowerPoint.
Okay, let me try this again. Share screen. Share screen. Window. Chrome tab. How do you see the section 504?
No, we're not seeing that.
Really?
Wait a minute. There it goes.
Okay,
How's
great.
that?
Okay, good. This will be better for me. That will make me get to the right thing. About that, we talked about. Okay, so we're talking about what's included in the 504 plan, and we're talking about reasonable accommodations and modifications, which I gave you guys some ideas of some things that we hear often, which would be the extra time, preferential seating. Sometimes we've got some students where maybe it's when they're taking a test, they don't have to fill in the circle. That was something that was really tricky for my son. That would take him a lot longer to do that than maybe just being able to circle the box. And so there's all kinds of things that folks can think about as far as reasonable accommodations. And accommodations aren't limited to just one area. So they could include physical, instructional, or behavioral supports. Again, we're talking about where we're not really changing what the curriculum or what the students expected to learn, but we might be changing something as far as how they demonstrate their knowledge or how they receive the information. And so when you're thinking about reasonable, this is another area where sometimes families and schools might collide or disagree on what is reasonable. And so you say, well, that's kind of subjective, and indeed it is. And so there's been, case law studies on this. And so case law has dictated that a modification or an accommodation or an adjustment might not be reasonable if it were to fundamentally alter the nature of the course or the curriculum or the program, or it might result in an undue administrative or financial burden for the school or the institution, or it might pose a threat to the health or safety of that individual or others. And so I know one time I was helping a family, her child had a condition where they were very, very, very light sensitive, especially their eyes. And so he was going to be starting kindergarten, and she had went and visited the school, and there was a very bright entryway. There was the classroom had a lot of windows. And so she was asking if they would cover the windows in the classroom in the entryway. And they said, no, we can't do that. But what we are willing to do is he can wear a brimmed hat, and he can also wear sunglasses all on campus in the building, wherever he wants, wherever he needs to. And the mom and the school were kind of battling on this. And in that instance, what the school offered was reasonable. Because they were still meeting what he needs, and then wasn't going to create them any kind of financial burden to go ahead and cover these windows. And then also thinking about there's some students and some people like me, I need some natural light. And so, those are often when folks are trying to figure out what's reasonable in a 504 plan, where we see some families and teachers where or school staff administrators might not be able to agree. I had a dad last year that his son had metabolic disorder, where he really needed to have access to snacks throughout the day, and the school allowed that, but they weren't allowing the student to eat the snack in the science classroom. They were asking that he go out into the hallway because they were using chemicals and other things. They were dissecting animals. They were doing all kinds of things that they thought could be hazardous. That was not a good place to be eating. And so the parents didn't like that the student was being asked to go out into the hallway. And so that was, that was something that was escalating. I'm not even sure how it ended, to be honest. But those are the kinds of things where folks might find places to argue is over what's reasonable for my kiddo. So what might a 504 plan look like? And so we haven't got to IEPs yet, but when we do, you'll learn that they're based on a federal model. And so North Carolina, all states have to align what they're doing with the federal model. And so North Carolina has a IEP form that they use. And now that they switched to a program called ECATS, all North Carolina public schools should be using the same form, because that can be confusing when you got folks that have the same information but packaged differently. But now we're seeing them come through that they're all the same in uniform. Well, Section 504, that act, it doesn't provide a standard form or a template for a 504 plan. And so we'll see them. Some are very detailed. Some don't have a lot of information on there. What's important is that it really details what accommodations that student needs, what setting they're going to be made available in, and who is going to be the person responsible for making sure the student gets the accommodation. And so, again, there's no standard 504 plan required by the law like the IEP. Every school district handles it a little differently. Generally speaking, the 504 plan should include these three bold printed items that you see. How are we going to support or serve the student? What classroom, because there's some accommodations that may be very specific to certain settings, and then there are some accommodations that may apply to all settings. And then the name of, maybe not the actual name of the teacher, but the role, is this going to be just the general education teacher that's going to be doing this? Is this going to be somebody else in the building that's going to be responsible? Sometimes we'll see some kiddos that have a 504, and these are kiddos that maybe have some accommodations because they have needs regarding behavior or organization. So they might have a check-in person. And oftentimes that check-in person might be somebody that the student has really formed a bond with. It could be a guidance counselor. It could be a teacher that's not even their own. So sometimes we'll see more specific or other people listed depending on what the accommodation is. And so this is an actual 504 plan of one of my coworkers who has a kiddo in elementary school. And so she was kind enough to say, hey, you can use this if you want to give folks an example of what it looks like. And so you can see that this kiddo gets his assignments broken down, we call that kind of chunking it, and it's chunked into smaller sequential steps. He gets additional time to complete assignments. Somebody dictates for writing assignments for him. He gets a lot of teacher check-ins to, checking for understanding, make sure that you understand, what you're expected to do. Do you know what you need to put in your book bag? Do you know what you need to take home? Do you know when it's due? That kind of stuff. Some kiddos get a lot of frequent breaks, or they might get sensory breaks. Some students might need visual supports. They might need a schedule or a graphic organizer. Checklists are really beneficial for a lot of students. And so this is just an example. I will tell you, one of my beefs when I see 504 plans or when I see accommodations, not really a beef, but something that I really encourage folks is to make sure that they are worded very specifically so that folks really have an understanding on what it is the child needs and what it is the teacher is supposed to be providing. And so when you see something like additional time to complete assignments, we don't really know. Does this kiddo need an extra 30 minutes? Or are we talking an extra 2 days? And so and what happens is this is where, again, we see some conflict because there was a misunderstanding on what that might look like. And so if you are creating a 504 plan, make sure, you go back through it and say, what does that mean exactly? As far as the additional time or the preferential seating, so nobody's guessing and then nobody ends up mad at each other, because that happens. Okay, I am going to attempt to show a video. So this is just it gives some good examples of what accommodations in the school setting might look like. So I'm going to stop this screen. I'm going to share a new screen. I know I have to share my sound. I just want to make sure I'm doing it right. Give me a second. I'm clicking the share audio. And Joanne, if you could just let me know if it's working, that'd be great.
Yes. Can you hear me, Amy?
Yep.
Good.
For students with disabilities, the right accommodations and modifications can be as important to school success as appropriate IEP goals. These educational supports are similar, but they are not the same. Accommodations change how a student accesses information, participates in school activities, or demonstrates their learning. They do not change the curriculum. Modifications, however, change what is being taught or what a student is expected to learn and demonstrate.
I only need you to do the circled problems for me.
Accommodations can be made by adjusting the amount of work a student must complete, allowing extra time,
Just go ahead and turn your paper in. Okay, you can go ahead and keep working. You've got about 5 more minutes.
adapting assignments,
Alex, I have your shapes here. Good.
providing extra assistance, or changing the physical setting.
Let's do one more page today.
There is no one set list. Because each child is unique, the IEP team must identify specific strategies to help your child succeed. For example, presenting a few math problems at a time may help a student who is easily overwhelmed. Another student might benefit from short breaks or being allowed to finish an assignment at home. A student who has difficulty writing may be allowed the use of a computer, while students with a print disability may benefit from having tests read aloud.
They went downtown.
A child can be given an appropriate role when working in small groups,
Where am I?
or be allowed to participate in an activity in a different way.
Beware of what? Excuse me.
Being seated near the teacher helps some students stay focused,
We'll go ahead and discuss these in a minute.
and assistive technology can support a wide range of needs.
And if you need me, you can raise your hand and I'll come and help you. All right?
In addition to accommodations, it is sometimes necessary to modify the curriculum. For example, when the class is learning how to tell time, one child might be expected to identify only the hours. While the class is working on vocabulary and spelling, another child may work from a shorter list or focus exclusively on the meaning of key words.
Insects with 8 legs.
Parents play a vital role in crafting the IEP. After all, no one knows your child better. So at home, watch for what works and any struggles that continue. Talk to your child about what feels right to him or to her. Make sure the IEP team considers your child's needs throughout the entire school day, including classroom time, non-academic and extracurricular activities, and transportation. You are not expected to have all the answers. Other members of the IEP team will have much to contribute. You can help by making sure that all accommodations and modifications are clearly written into the IEP. Be sure to ask whether any of the modifications will impact your child's graduation. Ask questions, offer ideas, and bring up any concerns you may have. Open dialogue and clear documentation are essential to developing a high-quality IEP.
That's the middle school.
I didn't know it was this far from the lockers to the buses.
During the IEP meeting, we can talk about adding extra time to Sam's schedule.
Oh, okay, great.
So we've talked about quite a few modifications today.
Hemos hablado acerca de muchas modificaciones.
¿Hay un límite?
She wants to know if there is a limit.
No, however, we do want to be careful if we create too many modifications, she may not be able to meet the high school graduation requirements.
Well, I know Tori likes being around other people, but she also has a hard time with conversation. So I was wondering, did you have, any other ideas that might help her with that?
Well, we could try a peer buddy, or we could work in small groups more often.
These are great goals, but Brooke's in the 6th grade and is only reading at a 2nd grade level.
This is true,
The audiobooks should help her access to content better. And I think we might be able to find some textbooks that are at a lower reading level.
Tori always turns in her homework, but it's not always what was assigned.
Maybe if you can help her get started in class, she'll know she's on the right track.
Sure, I could do that.
I'm unclear who will follow up with each of these items.
I'll handle supports during basic instruction.
And I'll arrange for the seatbelt and keyboard.
Accommodations and modifications should change as your child's needs change.
All right, time for comprehension. If comprehension, then iPad. Are you ready?
You are not limited to a standard list.
Can we play?
So be creative and stay involved.
Could we go to the park?
I would love to go to the park, but you're going to study first, right?
Your child is counting on you.
Thanks for helping each other out. That'll be great.
I'm laughing because that video has a ton of my coworkers, and my husband had a short role in that video. He had one line, and that was, oh my gosh, probably 4 years ago. And he still says that was the worst experience of his life, that he's not an actor. So I'm just still giggling about it because I'm thinking, really? You had one line and you did fine. So, all right, let me get back to the PowerPoint here. So you got some slides to see. I think I'm getting better at this streaming thing. Okay, is it showing IEP basics, Joanne? There we are. Okay, terrific. All right, I'm back where I needed to be. And so I just wanted to say in that video, it showed some really great accommodations. And again, accommodations are something that can be provided through a 504 plan. And now we're going to talk about IEPs, whereas 504s are pretty limited to just accommodations, and IEPs have accommodations and a whole lot more. And so I was rethinking about that question in the chat box as far as, you know, why have both? It really comes down to what the individual needs of the students are. And I realize that may be a challenge for foster parents, especially if you have a child where you don't really know yet how they do in school, or you don't have that history. And so it may be something that you might not know off the bat, which one do I want first, but it's certainly a conversation to have early if you're seeing things and the schools are seeing things as well. And so, some of the things that we know about foster children is that in general, they do tend to repeat grades more often. They have a higher rate of absenteeism, tardiness, truancy. They have a very high rate of dropping out. And they tend to have lower scores on the standardized test. Now, that last part is not something that isn't a huge issue to a lot of folks like me. The standardized test, most of us don't love it. The students don't love it. The parents don't love them. The teachers don't love it. And the administrators don't love them. But they're required to administer those tests. But we do see when we're, looking at the demographics on some of these things, we do see a higher rate of representation where when we're looking at dropout rates, that foster children are, I think one of the stats that I read, only 50% of them tend to graduate. Over 40% of foster children have educational difficulties. And so when you think about all children, right now, the stats kind of show that 10% of children have a disability, whereas 25% of foster children have a disability. And so that's why this information is so important to get into the hands of foster families, to know that could be on your radar, something that you need to be looking out for. And then also knowing, hey, I heard that there's ways to help these kiddos, and then getting in touch with the school or getting in touch with us and saying, here's my concerns, how should I proceed, kind of a thing. So we're going to do some IEP basics. The IEP stands for Individualized Education Program, and IEPs come from what we call the IDEA, or the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. I mentioned that is how parent training and information centers are funded as a result of the IDEA. And the sole purpose of the IDEA is to ensure that all children with disabilities have available to them this acronym that we often refer to as FAPE. And it's a free, appropriate public education that emphasizes the special education and related services designed to meet their unique needs and prepare them for further education, employment, and independent living. And so this IDEA is where we get our special education law. When it talks about special education, that's again referring to that specially designed instruction. When we're talking about related services, that might be speech therapy, occupational therapy, could be physical therapy, it could be vision services, hearing services, might be nursing services. And so there's a whole variety of related services that a student might need in order to benefit from the special education that they are receiving. And what's really important is that this piece about unique needs. And so sometimes, we'll hear folks say, I mentioned to the teacher that I have some concerns. And they say, well, that's all students. Or, if we did that for your student, then we couldn't for this one. Well, when we're having those conversations, that's nice, but we're really talking about the unique needs of this particular student and how they might be met. So what?
Amy?
Yes.
Amy, we do have an interesting thing is here.
Okay.
Valerie Thomas said when hers was created, the school said a scribe from the county was required to attend and to do the documentation on this. Is this common for people to have scribes do the documentation?
No, I haven't heard that. When we're talking about a 504, when we're talking about a 504 plan, the folks that are usually, or is this about an IEP?
She's referring to 504, she said.
Yeah, so typically the 504, that's kind of where things get kind of iffy because they don't have all the same guidance or must-haves as they do with an IEP. There's a whole process that has to be followed, whereas with 504, local education agencies kind of have some flexibility on how it's going to roll out, what it's going to look like, as long as it's including the right things. Typically, the districts will have what is called a 504 coordinator. Oftentimes, it's a guidance counselor that may have that role. And so since there is no standard plan, I guess folks could be doing it differently. That's interesting. I hadn't heard of it like that. Doesn't make it right or wrong. It just kind of more or less makes it interesting. Okay, so we talked a little bit about IEP as far as what it stands for, but think of it as this is basically the written document that is going to tell us how the unique educational needs of a student with a disability are going to be addressed. And so I mentioned earlier, students with IEPs are automatically covered under Section 504. It doesn't mean that they have a separate 504 plan. It just means that they are automatically covered under Section 504 as far as, having those protections and rights. IDEA has 6 core principles. The first one being that FAPE, that free, appropriate public education. I talked about with 504s where we often see folks disagree is over what's reasonable. When it comes to IEPs, most arguments are about what's appropriate. So as parents, it's only natural that we want what's best. But the fact of the matter is that schools are only obligated to provide what's appropriate. And so sometimes we will, see this is where, and parents would say, school's not doing what's best. And then we've kind of got to say, well, they don't have to do what's best, but they do have to do what's appropriate. And how do we determine if something is appropriate is the student able to still receive educational benefit from what they're providing? Is that student making progress? Those sorts of things. But oftentimes, this is where folks might end up utilizing some dispute resolution options when they feel like things aren't appropriate. So, some examples of, things where I have seen, some conflict is we have a lot of families that want their child to have a one-on-one. And whereas the school's saying we don't think that's appropriate. What we think is that the student maybe needs to be served in a smaller special education classroom where that teacher has additional support and there's less students, and we can meet the need that way. And so the school believes that what they're doing is appropriate, and the parents want more, what's best. And so that's just one example, but that's usually where folks will disagree on, what's appropriate. Sometimes we see it in the amount of related services. Maybe the parent wants that kiddo to have speech 3 times a week and the school feels like it's 1. And so these are some of the areas where the appropriateness becomes an area of contention. Other principles are appropriate evaluation. We want to make sure that we're using evaluations that are going to appropriately identify and address the needs and concerns that folks have for the student. Number 3 is the IEP. That is, again, that plan is intended to prepare that student for future education, employment, and independent living. The feds, when they drew up this IDEA, they said parent and student participation are a must-have. And so we're going to go over some of the opportunities where parents and students can participate. And we're also going to talk about who they identify as a parent. The least restrictive environment, often referred to as the LRE. As you can see, in special education world, there's a whole lot of acronyms. But the LRE, or the least restrictive environment, this is because schools have an obligation to educate students essentially as much as they can with their non-disabled peers, and that they're not removed from them. Folks really need to figure out what kind of support, supplementary aids, what can we put in place to keep this child with their non-disabled peers. And if they've tried those things and then we say, okay, we're still not having the success, or the student's not able to make progress with these, that's when they should then look at maybe the pull out or the placement in a special education classroom. But first and foremost, we have to remember that these students are general education students first. And then the procedural safeguards. These are also what we call the parent rights. And so those are the 6 core principles of the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. So unlike the 504 plan, there's no required members of the 504 team, whereas there are for the IEP team. And so those required members are a parent, or a general education teacher, a special education teacher, and then somebody that is known as the LEA representative. This LEA stands for Local Education Agency Rep. This is oftentimes a principal or an assistant principal. It has to be somebody that has knowledge of the district's resources, has knowledge of both general education and special education. So sometimes every now and then we might see an EC director serve in this role, but it's typically an administrator such as a principal or an assistant principal. If they're going to be going over any evaluation results, somebody has to be there that can interpret the instructional implications of those results. And so oftentimes it'll be a psychologist, or maybe you're going to go over the results of a speech language assessment, or maybe an occupational therapy evaluation. We want folks at the table that are not only able to tell us, here's what the results said, but here's what this might mean, or the implication as far as in regards to their educational environment. And then the student. And so students can attend IEP teams at any age, but they're required to be invited beginning at age 14. And so we have some students that are very strong self-advocates and are eager and want to be there. And then we have other students that, no thanks. And that was the case with my son. I made him go, but he didn't love being there. And, for some students, it's difficult to be in a room where folks are talking about you, whether it's good or bad. And certainly, you start off, you go over all the strengths, but at some point you address the concerns. And so my son, Joey, he didn't love being at those meetings. I had him go, but he wasn't a very active participant. But we have some students that are going at a young age and being able to say, hey, here's what I need. Here's what's working. And then we have some families, when they call us and I'll say, hey, is your kiddo going to go to that meeting? And they say, oh, he doesn't know that he has an IEP, or he doesn't know that he has a disability. And while that's a personal decision, we certainly encourage families to have that conversation with their students so that they can become strong self-advocates. And as they go on to future education, whether it's just advancing grade to grade or go on to college or go into the workplace, they have awareness about their disability and their needs. And then they're able to, tell folks, hey, here's what I'm going to need in order to have success in this environment. And so we mentioned that a parent is a required member of the IEP team. And so this is how the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act defines a parent. And so it could be a biological or adoptive parent, but it can also be a foster parent. And so as foster parents, you can serve in that role unless you are a therapeutic foster parent. There is some language and wording in there that does exclude therapeutic foster parents. So if that's you, then you would not be able to serve in that role, but that doesn't mean that you couldn't participate. Whoever is serving in the role as a parent, they can invite anybody that they want to those IEP meetings. And so it's not that you can't participate, you would have to have an invitation. But otherwise, if you are serving as a foster parent and you are fostering a child that has an IEP, or you are fostering a child that you think may be in need of an IEP, then you absolutely can initiate that process and attend and have an active role in those meetings. And then they also go on to talk about how it can be a guardian, somebody that's authorized to act as the child's parent, or it could be an individual acting in place of the biological or adoptive parent. And so this is oftentimes could be a step parent or a grandparent. And then also a surrogate parent. And so surrogate parents are typically put in place for those students that their parents cannot be located, maybe they haven't responded. It's somebody that maybe their parents are off the radar, they're incarcerated. For whatever reason, they can't identify them, and they can't identify anybody that serves in any of these other roles, a foster parent or a guardian. Or a family member. And so in that case, the district would have to put in place somebody that's known as a surrogate parent. These are folks that it's a volunteer role, and that usually the districts will have, already identified and put into place. And so it's not often that there are meetings with a surrogate parent, but it can happen. And so if you're kind of new to the game and you go, well, how does this even work? What are the steps in the special education process? Basically, it has to start with a referral. And this typically occurs where the parent is making a written request. Sometimes the school might send you the written request and say, hey, we have some concerns. We would like to refer your child for special education. If you are a foster parent and you wanted to start this process, we would encourage you to do it in writing. And we've got a ton of sample letters that we can provide you with. If you say, well, I don't know what to say, we've got some really good products and resources that we can help you in that process. And so you would write that letter, and it could just say, hey, I'm the parent of John, and I've noticed that he's, when we're doing homework, he's really struggling, or, I noticed that the school's called me a lot about his behavior. I'd like to have my child evaluated for special education services. And so once they receive that written notification, that starts what we call the 90-day timeline. And that 90 days gives them 90 days to complete this entire process. And so that's why we encourage folks to do it in writing. Now, what happens is if you said to a teacher or administrator or somebody at the school, hey, I have some concerns about Johnny, I'm wondering if he needs something more, that really should be their tip to tell you, oh, if you would like to have him evaluated, you'll need to put that request in writing. If you need assistance writing that, I can help you. Oftentimes what happens is parents have reached out to a teacher or a guidance counselor or a principal, and the conversation ends there. It's kind of like, we'll keep an eye on it. Oh, maybe, kind of thing. But really, that really is under their child find obligation. That really is where they should initiate and say, oh, just go ahead and put it in writing. Or if you need help putting in writing, I can do that. So you make that referral. What happens once they receive that is the school should be contacting you pretty quickly to say, hey, let's have a meeting. And they call that a special education referral meeting. And they're going to meet and they're going to go over, the student's strengths. They're going to go over your concerns. They're going to say, what do we already know about this kid? And you may have a lot of information or you may have very little, depending on the child's history and what information you were provided, but you go with what you know, you go with what your concerns are. They're going to review any existing data that there is. And they're basically going to go through it all and they're going to say, okay, well, they have three choices to make. They're either going to say, no, we are not going to move forward with an evaluation. If they say that, they have to document why. Or they're going to say, we think that we need to go forward and evaluate this child. Or maybe you come to the table and you already have a lot of information or all the evaluations that kiddo might need. And they might say, okay, we don't need to evaluate. We have enough to move forward to discuss eligibility. It doesn't typically happen because the state has required tests and evaluations they have to do. But every now and then, somebody might have almost all the pieces that very little is required. Again, if you get to where they say, no, we're not going to evaluate, they have to document why. I did a couple years ago, I was actually helping a guardian ad litem that was helping a family that had a kiddo that was doing really, really poorly in school. And they had, right off the bat, and they had put in a written referral, and the school had decided not to evaluate. And the reason why is because they could not determine, they weren't so sure that this was actually a student with a disability, or if it was because the student had just had a lack of appropriate instruction. He had missed so much school in his former home and placements that nobody really knew, is his struggles because it just hasn't been taught, or is his struggles the result of a disability? So it took about another 6 months where he had some good solid instruction where folks said, okay, I think we have enough to move forward. This kid's, been given the quality instruction in reading and in math and is still struggling. And so they did move forward and end up evaluating him. And so the evaluation process, that is something that they would need written permission from you to evaluate. They have 14 different categories that they can evaluate a child under. One might be autism. We've got developmental delay. That's for kiddos under the age of 8. There is specific learning disabilities. There is traumatic brain injury. We also have students that have emotional disabilities, and foster children. They are often overrepresented in this particular category. And we know that they do, they oftentimes come with a history of trauma. And so there's 14 different categories that they can choose from. And that's going to be a team decision as they say, okay, if they say, yeah, we're going to move forward with the evaluation, let's think about what are the concerns? What do we know? What areas do we think it makes the most sense to evaluate under? And so after those evaluations are complete, and those evaluations include a lot of observations, there's formal assessments that they will do in different areas. They'll come back to the table and say, okay, let's go over these results. And let's determine eligibility based on these results. And so in order to be found eligible, the student not only has to have a disability in one of those 14 categories, the disability has to have an adverse effect on their educational performance, and it must require specially designed instruction. And so again, this is oftentimes where folks disagree. And what's really important, or I love to drive home any opportunity I get to talk to folks, when we are talking about educational performance, we are not just talking about grades. We hear this all the time where family is calling and saying, well, they're saying they can't help him because he's on grade level. We have a lot of students out there that are students with disabilities that are very bright, very smart, high cognition, do very well on their assignments and their tests, but really struggle with their functional skills. And so these skills could be with communication, behavior, social, emotional skills, self-regulation. And so it's really important that folks remember that adverse effect on educational performance. Educational performance is not limited to academics. It is not just about grades. There's a whole population out there that is struggling in these other areas where they might need support or specially designed instruction. And so for those students that are struggling, not all of them are going to need specially designed instruction. So we'll see that sometimes this is where the road ends and they say, we saw some stuff, but we can meet all these needs with a 504 plan. This is just a student that needs some accommodations. And that's okay for some of those students, but there's some students where they're going to need both the accommodations and they're going to need that specially designed instruction. They are going to need that instruction given in a way that meets their individual needs. And that typically comes from a special education teacher or an exceptional children's teacher. And so they'll go through that. If they just determine that the child is eligible, they're going to move forward and create the IEP. If they determine the child is not eligible, they have to document why. They have to, whether eligible or not eligible, they have a paperwork called a prior written notice, and they're going to have to detail anything that was proposed and anything that was refused and why. And so if the student is eligible, they're going to go ahead and create that IEP, and we're going to look at some samples of what an IEP looks like and what all is included in there. And then they're going to determine what we call placement. And so again, this kind of talks about that LRE, that least restrictive environment. You know, how much time is a student going to spend where? And any time that student's going to be removed from their least restrictive environment where their placement is going to be changed some, they got to detail why. And typically that would be students that maybe they're getting pulled away to get their speech therapy, or maybe they're going to what we call the resource classroom, maybe working in a group setting with other students with IEPs, or we have some students that, depending on their needs, are unable to have success in the gen ed classroom, and they're spending their entire day in the special education classroom. It really, again, it will be a team decision, and it will be based on that student's individual needs. So the IEP is loaded. It's way more complicated than the 504. The 504, again, just talks about accommodations, where they're going to happen, who's going to provide them, whereas the IEP's got a whole lot going on. And it starts off where they're going to talk about the parent concerns. It starts off with the student strengths, which will be determined by the school staff and the parents. Everybody gets to chime in on what the strengths are. And then there's a section for the parent concerns. And this really is a place I just tell folks, make sure you get your concerns in there, because that is one part of the IEP that's not determined by the team. It's all you. And it's a great place to communicate all that you have concerns about. Could be grades, could be relationships, making friends, could be maybe you have concerns with behavior, all of it. So it's a good place to kind of say, here's what we're concerned about. Here's why we've come together today. And then your vision for the child's future, and then if the student's able to draft their own vision statement, what do they want to do after high school? What is their goals? And then they talk about the present levels. Where is this kid at now? How are they doing in reading? How are they doing in math? How are they doing with their communication skills, behavior? They'll list the goals. They're going to say how they're going to measure progress, how often they're going to report it. They're going to talk about any specially designed instruction the kiddo is going to receive, and if the child's going to get any extra services, what they will be, how often, where they will occur, how that student's going to participate in tests, either with accommodations or the same as every other student, or maybe they're going to take the alternate assessment. And then it's also going to list those accommodations, which is what you would see in the 504 plan. So again, the IEP has a lot more plus accommodations.
So,
and this just
Amy,
gives you, yep.
Amy, there is a comment in the box.
Okay.
And it says, it's from Rebecca and Jamie. It says, yes, we've had the same complaints with our now adopted son the past 2 years, where both teachers reached out to us on this issue. However, he has straight A's and test scores are his, and we've been told that he wouldn't need a 504. Our concern, and the teacher has agreed, is that while they've worked with him without a 504 plan, whatever happens to him, the teacher doesn't. What happens when the teacher doesn't, and we have to wait until grades and are affected in order to justify having a 504 in print. And I think that is a problem. And I can you recommend any things that can keep the family and the teacher current on the behavior cited on the 504, or the concerns cited on the 504?
I'm going to go back and look at this and reread this. Make sure our concern. He's straight A's in the test are great, so we've been told he wouldn't need it. Yeah, and so yeah, you're being told the same thing a lot of people are being told. It is not all about the grades, whether we're talking about 504s or IEPs. And so, all right, so you think about that 504 plan. It's all about providing reasonable accommodations. And so we see kids with diabetes get a 504 plan. We see kids with asthma get a 504 plan. We see kids with epilepsy get a 504 plan. And some of these kids are straight A students. And nobody says to them, we're not going to give you a 504 plan because he makes good grades. They go, oh, yeah, that's a condition that requires something. And that should be the same for any student with any condition that is limiting them in a major life activity. So in that kind of case, if you kind of keep getting the runaround, we've got some really creative wording that we can help parents use when communicating with the school. Written communication is best, creates a paper trail. It makes for some accountability. It's good record keeping. And sometimes for those parents that, keep getting stuck, then we say, well, send that email to them and copy us on it. And sometimes suddenly people want to come back to the table and re-talk. Sometimes that helps. Sometimes they go, oh, ECAC, who cares? But sometimes they go, oh, okay, maybe we should look at this with a new lens. But that would be a perfect time to give us a call, talk to one of our parent educators and kind of give us the background, and then we can help you move forward.
Thank you, Amy.
Okay. The next slides are just an example of what the North Carolina IEP forms look like. And so I just wanted to show you, I already talked about all the components on there because I know we're pressed for running out of time. So you can see it's a standard form that the state uses, and it has a lot more going on than the 504 plan. It doesn't mean that the 504 plan isn't enough for some students, but for those students that need specially designed instruction, it is a lot more detailed. So you can see it's a lengthy document. At the end, everybody's got to sign that they participated. If you're wondering which plan is right for my child, it all comes down to, does the student require specialized instruction? If yes, then the IEP is going to be the correct plan. If no, the student just needs some accommodations, we just need a couple changes to the environment, the curriculum, the format, a 504 can do that.
Amy, thank you so much. Your wonderful presentation.
Well, and I feel like I missed some stuff, but can I, for folks that are still here, can I paste a survey link in the chat box real quick?
Yes, please do. And please follow up with Amy and ECAC. They are there for you. And they have you have some wonderful options here. And I hope that all of you enjoyed this session. Are you able to get them, Amy?
It's letting me put it in the private chat, but not the comments. Is that how that works?
Well, you can also get the emails of all the folks that are going.
Oh, great, because that's one of the things I put in my survey was, let me know if you want me to email you particular resources on this subject and things specific to foster families. Be happy to do that. Because we are federally funded, they want us to get that evaluation stuff out. So I created one, but I don't know if it's showing up for folks.
Everyone is saying thank you for the wonderful information.
Well, yay, thank you.
And we will, we do have a closing that you all can go to. You may win a prize.
Ooh.
And you have been a prize for us, Amy. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you. And I'm sorry I had the wrong thing up first and I had to get my groove back. But yes, Joanne, if you guys are willing to share the email addresses, I would love to follow up and get some resources in your hands. And feel free to reach out with your individual questions. Thank you so much.
Yeah, great to see you, hon. Take care, everybody.
Bye, everybody. Take care. And thanks for all you do. Rock stars you are.